The bugles on the bluffs had barely faded when the men in the shallow ditch pushed up and ran. It was full daylight on May 22nd, 1863. Vicksburg's line rose in angles of packed earth and sandbags, bristling with guns. Union troops moved in waves toward the stockade redan and the railroad redoubt, carrying ladders and planks. Naval guns on the Mississippi threw shells over their heads. The sound ran together. The chop of muskets, the boom of artillery, the shock of shells behind the works. A storming party known as a Forlorn Hope reached the ditch and found the wall too high to climb under fire. Flags planted close to the parapet hung still in the heat. After hours pinned in the open, stretcher details crawled forward and the survivors pulled back. The assault had failed. Vicksburg would not be taken by a rush. The city mattered because of where it sat. Its high ground controlled a long bend of the Mississippi River. For 2 years, the Union had been closing the river post by post, but guns here still kept a vital stretch open between the trans-Mississippi and the eastern states. Break that link, and the Confederacy would be cut in two. Through late 1862 and early 1863, Major General Ulysses S. Grant tried to reach the city by every route the low ground allowed, through Yazoo passes clogged with timber, along bayous where levees had to be cut, and straight down the main channel under the bluffs. Each attempt met water, mud, or guns on higher ground. The campaign turned when Grant changed the problem. On the night of April 16, 1863, Rear Admiral David D. Porter ran a column of ironclads and transports past the batteries in the dark. Confederate guns opened as the boats slid by, stacks shrouded, barges lashed close, cotton and hay shielding boilers. Several vessels took hits. One transport burned. Most made it through. A second run followed on April 22nd. With a fleet below the city at last, Grant ferried his army across at Bruinsburg beginning April 30th, the largest amphibious operation in American history to that date. He moved inland fast to keep Confederate forces divided. On May 1st at Port Gibson, Union troops pushed the defenders back and secured the roads. That opened a path into the interior. Grant turned east toward Jackson, where General Joseph E. Johnston was assembling troops. At Raymond on May 12th, Union forces beat a smaller Confederate command. 2 days later, they entered Jackson after sharp fighting, destroyed military facilities, and cut the rail link. Grant pivoted west at once. Between him and Vicksburg stood Lieutenant General John C. Pemberton's army. The open field decision came at Champion Hill on May 16th, a ridge where control of a crossroads meant control of the field. Union attacks took the crest, were checked by a Confederate counterstroke, and then regained the heights. Pemberton's line bent and peeled back toward the Big Black River. On May 17th, at the bridge across that river, Union assaults broke through again, sending much of the Confederate force in a disorderly retreat into Vicksburg's fortifications. Grant followed and tried to end it quickly. His first probe on May 19th faltered. The May 22nd assault, planned with artillery preparation and attacks along a broad front, went in harder and suffered more. Ravines, abatis, and ditches in front of mutually supporting forts favored the defense. The men who reached the base of the parapets could not climb them under fire. By evening, the Army of the Tennessee had taken heavy casualties for no gain. Grant settled on siege. Union engineers pushed approaches forward by saps, laying zigzag trenches and setting batteries to pound specific forts. Artillery on the bluffs and gunboats on the river kept pressure on the city. Confederate artillerists answered when they could. On quiet days, sharpshooters did the killing. On heavy days, entire sections of the works shook under bombardment. In June, miners drove a tunnel under the 3rd Louisiana Redan and set off a massive charge on June 25th. The breach filled with smoke and hand-to-hand fighting, and the line held. A second blast a few days later left another crater and more close-range struggle with no breakthrough. The siege lasted 47 days. Inside Vicksburg, civilians dug caves into the lowest hillsides and lived in them during bombardments. Newspapers printed on wallpaper when supplies ran short. Rations dwindled to coarse bread and odd cuts of meat. Accounts describe eating mule when commissary stores ran out. Disease spread in crowded shelters and camps. Outside the lines, Union soldiers built an encircling city, camps, depots, bakeries, hospitals, corrals, and miles of trenches. Heat and flies made rest scarce. Fatigue and bad water did steady damage. The work never stopped. Relief never came. Johnston maneuvered east of the Big Black with a force too small to break Grant's lines. Pemberton faced a choice: attempt a breakout with worn troops and little food, or hold and hope. He held. Grant's army, now reinforced to more than 70,000 men, tightened the ring. By late June, the Confederate garrison, about 29,000 at the start of the siege, was on reduced rations with no clear line of retreat. On July 3rd, Pemberton asked for terms. He and Grant met under a tree between the lines. Grant first demanded unconditional surrender, then agreed to parole the garrison rather than send tens of thousands of prisoners north. Pemberton accepted. On July 4th, 1863, the Confederate army in Vicksburg marched out, stacked arms, and returned inside the works to await parole. Union troops raised the flag. The captures included more than 100 guns, ammunition, and supplies that could no longer hold the river. The consequences were immediate. On July 9th, Port Hudson, the last Confederate post on the lower Mississippi, surrendered to Major General Nathaniel P. Banks after news of Vicksburg's fall. With both strongholds down, the river ran in Union control from source to mouth. The Confederacy was split. Movement of men, food, and animals from west of the river into the eastern states dropped to a trickle. The long Union plan to cut the country in two, what officers in the West had been building toward since 1861, was complete. The cost was high, even without counting the surrender. In the Vicksburg campaign and siege, Union losses ran to roughly 10,000 killed, wounded, and missing. Confederate losses in the field before July 4th were several thousand. The surrender added about 29,000 more who laid down their arms. Disease, heat, bad water, and constant work increased the toll on both sides. Civilians who endured the siege carried its mark for years. Vicksburg fell the same week as Gettysburg. News from Pennsylvania dominated Eastern papers, but soldiers in the West understood the weight of what they had done. Grant's operations, running the batteries, crossing at Bruinsburg, beating Pemberton in the open, and then investing the city, show what a disciplined army with strong supply and engineering could force in rough ground. He moved his corps quickly, supported them with a river fleet, and took the decisive objective without a third major assault. After the surrender, the Union buried its dead, paroled prisoners, and turned to the next work. Units cleared remaining Confederate posts on the Yazoo and held the rail lines that fed the river. Grant's reputation rose. He would soon be called east to take a larger command. Pemberton, a northern-born officer who had cast his lot with the South, resigned and later returned to duty as an artillery officer. Walk the lines today, and the ground still explains the outcome. The forts sit on commanding heights, but each approach is a funnel, and the surrounding hills give an attacker with time a place to build forward. Ravines hold the memory of saps and trenches. Markers show where the mine went off and where the assaults failed. The bend of the river below the bluffs makes clear why guns there mattered in 1862 and why a fleet to the south changed everything in 1863. The siege was not dramatic hour by hour the way a single battle is. It was a grind, earthworks, heat, and pressure. A mine, a sudden push, a brief breach stood out because most hours were dirt, sweat, and the steady pound of artillery. That pace is why it succeeded. Grant did not need to break the line at every point. He had to hold the city shut until food and will ran out. Thank you for listening to Last Post History. Subscribe for more true stories from the world at war.